Good morning. And my task this morning, I don't remember volunteering for this, by the way. I just got sucked into the conversations because they were really interesting. So my task is to invite this group of clever people who are interested in change to discuss something and to report back and to potentially continue the conversation after the conference. And so that's very exciting. Talking about an ontology of a new system is difficult, and there have been some long, difficult conversations so far because there are so many different perspectives and none of them necessarily right or wrong, just different. So it's hard. And it's been mentioned by several people in the build-up discussions that if we're building an ontology of something, we need to know what that something is, but we haven't defined it yet. So yeah, over to you. How do we define it rather than just describe it vaguely? And more importantly, when we try to do that, what issues arise that make it difficult? For example, one of the labels suggested for the new economy is the regenerative economy. But bear in mind that the CEO of Unilever has recently claimed that Unilever is part of the regenerative economy, similar to the way that Uber claimed the sharing economy, and they got it. What do we think about that? Does co-option of anything we try to build matter? How big a tent can we be? So just to repeat, the question is, when you try to define this thing that we're building an ontology of, this new economy or whatever it's called, what are the issues that come up that make it difficult? Those issues could be interpersonal or about shared values or the lack of them, or around language or ideology, or the potential for co-option by organizations we really don't want to be in bed with, or anything else.
Thank you, Dave, and thank you, Ollie. Just to endorse everything Dave says about that, so Dave was really focusing on the big question of what are we talking about, ontology of what? And just to remind people, an ontology really is just a fancy word, a jargon word for getting our meaning together as to what we actually mean by different terms, what different concepts we're using, and how they're related together. Don't be put off by the word ontology. We promise not to use it too much. We promise to say what we mean in simpler terms. And in fact, that's really the whole point of the whole thing. In order to help each other collaborate, in order to coordinate and communicate around our common task, which is, for most people here, I think, are interested in this big task of building a better economy, a new economy, a more just, etc., whatever you want to call it. We all, even though we find difficulty naming it, I think we all very much have similar ideals, similar values, and just a bit like the Tower of Babel, it's a bit. We're prevented quite often from collaborating and communicating effectively simply by misunderstandings and difficulties in communication. And that even also helps to prevent us knowing who else is doing similar things. Because if we're calling similar things in different ways, if we're using different terms, we may not know about them. And that's one of the really important things which Ollie mentioned earlier. Very much like to endorse. So really, what we're doing here and what we're trying to set out in the long term, not just today, but today is a taster, but really this is a taster for a really worthwhile long-term project to help provide some of the information glue between the different people working in this area. We don't know exactly how to do it, and we don't know exactly what we will need. So apart from being clear, as Dave said, as well as being clear as what Dave said as to what we're trying to do, and noticing what issues come up when we try and do that, we also want people, and also asking people to, inviting people to say, what do we actually need in order to help us do it? Do we need different tools? How do we motivate each other? What conditions are there? What governance structures, if any, or informal probably, what practices do we need for communication? How do we make people feel safe in communicating and collaborating? And how do we ensure the right kind of diversity not just of the superficial things and visible things, but also the invisible things. Right, thank you everybody. Welcome back. Firstly, what were the most common or important points raised in terms of the difficulty and challenges of saying what it is we're making ontology of? And secondly, what do we need to be able to move forward? Go ahead.
In our group, we talk quite a bit about a concept being linguistic antibodies. We have to be linguistic antibodies to fight against the misuse of language and to put people straight. And a couple of the main problems discussed were time. You actually need time to explain complicated ideas, and you have to use a lot of words to explain a complicated idea, and people may not give you the time. And so you have to simplify, and that's really difficult.
And just following on from that, in the group I was in, there was a number of different perspectives, but in particular, linking in practical activities, practical work was important, and also feminine side, cyclical being seen as more feminine rather than linear, and the concept of sustainability. A really good example that the concept of sustainability is a real obstacle because people mean different things by it. So I think there's a lot of general appreciation of this kind of initiative that we're starting here.
So I wanted to build on what Simon said. I agree. We were talking about how building something together allows you to explore deeper, like, oh, well, actually, even though I meant this, you and I agree on the next steps, or also to refine better what we mean as we work through the actual projects together. And what we said, or one of the things that we were talking about, I want to say we, but I talked a lot, was that if we're able to improve our communication skills, we can allow ourselves to not get triggered and to go deeper with the people that we're working with. And that inside of our commitment, like that there's a general commitment in this group to create an economy that works for everyone. And that as long as we keep in mind that, oh, that's what we're after, and we just keep diving deeper with one another. And you know, and I said one of the things we need is that to all develop that skill of listening at a deeper level, to all develop that tolerance and that self-awareness of, like, if I can continue to stay in the conversation, even when that ontology triggers me, or even when that, then as we develop those skills, we'll be able to build together, even if, like, we don't agree on all the nuances. So that was kind of how we looked at it.
That's a really helpful point. Thank you very much.
Mark, did you want to say something?
Yeah, just it's a couple of things that I didn't get a chance to bring up in the group, but that have been sort of part of a churning process that's going on in my head for quite a long time now. That this ontology conversation has thrown up. So one is that there's an internal and an external issue here. So some of the stuff that I'm really excited about, I've struggled to engage with. So, for instance, I was recently in a webinar about discos, distributed co-ops. And because of some of the language that was being used there, that was common within that discussion, that was difficult for me, it got to that point where you think that, well, there's a word that I'm not sure about, but it's probably that, and now there's another one, and pretty soon you're on shifting sound. So there's that internal stuff. Then there's the how do, you know, where in my work where I'm helping people set up cooperatives, what's the language I use within there that is relevant to the people I'm working with, and that even more so the language that sort of that we might be using would just be irrelevant or opaque to them. And then also there's the context. So if like the Abbie Hoffman chucking money into the New York Stock Exchange years ago as a stunt, and the stock exchange stopped working while everyone scrabbled for the money. It's a bit like we're trying to have a conversation in that context, that where if we're trying to be rational, and the people talked in our group about Brian Cox, about able to bring in people to a rational understanding of science, because he was able to sort of cut through that. but he's having that conversation in quite a controlled environment. Where if you're, if we're in the last days of capitalism and stuff is collapsing all around us, and capitalism is trying to reinvent itself even faster than it ever has before. So we're having a conversation in that chaos where it's really hard to have a decent conversation, and the rules are changing. So that's my ramble anyway. So one is that there's two aspects to this, and there's an additional context as well.
Thank you. Great.
We ended up starting to talk about trying to work out what was meant by new economy.
Right.
And it was just like, well, what the hell is it? What the hell is it? One example was Letchworth Garden City, but it was supposed to be the new economy, and it was like a new economy and a new architecture for the new way of living, and that was essentially and we're still in the same situation. It became just another extension of the same situation that we're in now.
Oh, Billy's gone. I was just going to ask if you came up with any sort of ideas about how that sort of stuff can be avoided.
Well, we didn't get to the point where we had that. We had that conversation.
And we found, just to point out to other people, that Dave, Ollie, Bree McIntosh, and myself have spent several hours in conversation, and we've really finally got to actually understanding each other's position. Recommended. So, but it does take a few hours to do that.
I have something to say on this point from my observation yesterday and today in the breakout rooms, how important to connect with others through their narratives. So that when people are telling their stories and why they are here, so I find that I have a common mission with people I don't know. And then we can talk to each other. And this connection, for me, is the most valuable thing, and it is a very enriching, so that conversations and narratives and stories for each one is a good way to work together.
Yes, thank you very much for that. And I think we all recognize that to hear our narratives properly takes longer than we had. And I'm really sorry for people whose narratives didn't get fully heard, because I think it's really important. Absolutely.
I was talking about Heraclitean river of language. It's constantly changing around us. What I was saying, trying not to stretch the metaphor too far, was that we can't hope to swim against the current for too long. We can, however, anchor ourselves to points on the river with metaphorical ropes, hope they don't break. What I was really getting at was, I think it's utterly futile to try to hang on to language. It will be misappropriated, turned against us. We cannot prevent anyone using words to mean anything they want to. But we can, however, reference good definitions of what we're trying to express. People take whole books to define concepts, and they are extremely valuable, but they'll be using a different vocabulary from the one we're using now. And the vocabulary we use really depends very much upon our age. We're used to precise meanings of words at one point in our lives, and finding a decade or two later, the whole generation has skipped to a completely different interpretation of those words. It's not safe to use a word like refute to mean disprove. It will be misinterpreted as denied by many people, including politicians. Whole generations, several generations, will misuse the word ignorant. Words like anarchism and cybernetics have to be anchored in definitions from the past, because they're not understood well now. And about 20 or 30 years ago, the word ontology would unambiguously have been a branch of metaphysics, nothing to do with models and language, really. So, except in that context, and we can't do anything about it. And we can't stop Unilever or whatever calling themselves sustainable. We can't prevent them from claiming to be the good guys.
Yeah.
But Humpty Dumpty has the right to use words any way he likes, and that's another thing. Lewis Carroll, wonderful reference for almost everything in language.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, anarchism has been particularly demonized, hasn't it? And misrepresented completely.
The American heritage. The American Heritage Dictionary has a one-word definition: chaos.
Yeah.
They know nothing about it.
Nothing about it at all.
Great.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, everybody. That's great. Really nice.